Parts of the building have been eroded, parts of it have been fixed. It holds those memories, those presences, those energies.
And the meaning and the lives that went into that. They're infusing that humanness, that quality of presence, of being into the thing that they're making. Welcome to the Black Sable podcast, where we explore the hidden side of architecture. Joining me in the studio today is Dirk Bahmann, who is an academic, currently doing his PhD. He's an architect as well as an artist. And we're going to be exploring, having a conversation to figure out exactly what he has done through his career, adjacent to as well as in architecture. Welcome, Dirk. Good to have you.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
So we've had many conversations over the years. So I'm really grateful that we can eventually have something that other people can engage with as well. Before we get into it, I just want to hear, tell me a little bit, very high level, architecture. When did you study? What was the time frame that you studied? And also kind of when did you start making a switch from architecture to artist, and then again a switch from artist to academic? Or when did that how did that all kind of play out?
So when I was a student, for me, I had two really fantastic lecturers, Sally Gall and Jenny Stadler. And they ran the graphics courses. And when I was a student...
Just to clarify, this is an architecture student.
Architecture student. So in the architecture degree, it was a course that ran over 3 years.
Oh.
And essentially they dealt with art history, and they had a sketchbook project that each week you worked on a sketchbook, but never in this is how to sketch. They were like collect plastic or collect rubbish and assemble that in your sketchbook, make textures. And as someone coming out of a very, I came through kind of apartheid eras growing up, and went to a school in Centurion for Woodburgstad at that stage. So it was a very...
Sorry, was this... I don't know this. Was Centurion called for Woodburgstad?
Yeah.
That is terrifying.
So okay. Kind of where I went to high school was a very military-orientated communities, and therefore came with all the kind of conservative Afrikaner baggage, even though I went to an English school. And the notions of creativity, like I wasn't always wanted to do art, but never done it because of the way in which these schools were orientated.
Okay.
And
did they offer art in school?
They offered art, but it was always looked down on. And likewise with anything technical, so technical drawing, woodworking,
also viewed as below.
It was always viewed where of those students who were academically challenged, that's what they did. And because I wanted to get to university, I was encouraged not to do those things.
It's ironic because when I did my high school career in 2002 to 6, the same conversation was still prevalent. I would have loved to have done woodwork if it was viewed as something that is worth pursuing. Yeah. But we're so obsessed with intellectual that we forget that there are all these other intelligences that exist.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So
I came through school kind of really lacking any kind of real creativity, although had been for a long time been interested in kind of underground subcultures, and because they're always creative and they're always kind of challenging the established order, there was a sense of creativity there, but I had nothing on my own. And when I did these courses, it just opened my world out. Before I had no interest in art or art history on my own. And because of these two people, one, I think the core thing that they taught me to do is to see the world differently, is that our perception is, it isn't fixed in any kind of way. And like the exercises that they gave me, collect rubbish and assemble that rubbish, all of a sudden you start noticing, these things have got patinas, there's beautiful, they have a beauty inherent in them, and they're inherently discarded. And in re-looking at the world, all of a sudden there was the realization if you sit long enough and you're quiet in your mind, like the world is teeming with these immense beauties. And for me, that was a fundamental shift in my awareness of being in the world.
And what's interesting also, like, it's funny because there's many ways you can, for argument's sake, do that. Like you could, for argument's sake, I can imagine, like, go look at some, I don't know, some rocks maybe, and you'll see, like lichen growing on the rock, and you start zooming into that, and you start seeing the beauty and the intrigue and the kind of the fractals that happen in that. But because it is inherently, it has some value to it already, because it's like part of nature, and it has, we kind of, because we're natural beings, we kind of experience these things as having value. But taking something that is inherently not valued, it has been thrown out, it is devalued to the nth degree, it is not worth doing anything with. Taking that and then trying to imbue value in that is obviously much more powerful and embeds a different kind of way of seeing than just picking random stuff. Like you could, like a stick or whatever, you can still see value there. Besides the kind of the beauty of it, you can still see like, oh, we can make fire out of it, we could, make a tool out of it. But with rubbish or kind of refuse, it's a more powerful message. So that's quite interesting that they did that. So
and then also combined with that was exposure to contemporary art history. So they'd have weekly lectures, and they'd run through a series of contemporary, or all the mainstays of contemporary artists, sculptors, painters, and talk about their work. And not in a, like, you're going to be tested on this, but as a, this is interesting. We looked at Anthony Caro this week. This week we're looking at another sculptor.
It doesn't matter because it's,
and kind of comparing, the differences in techniques and what their work does and how their work speaks and how they're using different languages, and would have a conversation about that. And then would have, weekly life drawing classes. And then,
so how many? Just out of curiosity, how many is this? Was like a full day thing? It was once a week, or
it wasn't it? It was a Friday.
Oh, that's a good day for that.
I think it was a lecture in the morning, and then a kind of drawing or making class in the afternoon. It was a full day, as far as I remember. And for me, that was pretty much the most inspiring thing that I experienced at university, and also their lack of judgment. So like I would be I remember, especially in the probably the first 2 weeks of class, they gave you an exercise, just draw lines. You're just drawing lines. You're not drawing a thing, you're drawing lines. And like, here's paper, draw lines. And like, coming from this conservative high school background, like everything, there was always an agenda, we're going to look pretty. And I was drawing these lines, and I remember Jenny Stabler coming up and watching and saying like, yeah, that's great. Like I see there's a lot of anger and aggression, like put it into the paper, like express it, get it in there. And I was like, like someone who's not like fit the mold and adjust to the mold is like, here's your being, like whatever is there, like explore it and experience it. And for me, that just kind of opened my world, which was fascinating at a young formative stage.
And just to clarify, I mean, we're talking essentially from like 19 to 21. Those are the 3 years, if I'm right.
Yeah.
As you describe in the story, a kind of a memory comes up from school where there was this, because I also did art at school. Also, I was in an Afrikaans school, so it was a bit more. It was more conservative. And then, for example, I think the general kind of school kind of areas, school zeitgeists at the time. And it was also like, in many ways, it was also like, it felt a bit, I don't want to go too political here, but it was like there weren't a lot of like non-white people in the class and in the school. So it was this really weird space to be in. And I just remember in like an art class, you'd be drawing and then there'd be this brigade of fellow students who would, and I say brigade, I mean, there's maybe like 5 of them that would walk around and in the same insipid, like super sweet voice, be like, oh, that's pretty, to literally to every person they looked at. And you know, like fundamentally, that this thing is, they don't think it's pretty. And I have it as the same way. I once did this painting of my mom, and it wasn't my idea. Like my friend gave it to, like said to me, why don't you do this? And I was like, oh, that's such a good idea. And invariably, because it wasn't mine, it was horrible. It was so bad. And I drew like a shitty piano because mom likes piano. It was like just the most basic, like it was just horrible. And I painted the whole thing, and I was so like, this is fucking ugly. And I remember them walking past going, oh, that's pretty. And I was like, what do you mean? We both know this is fucking ugly. And I'm really grateful that I've experienced this, because now I know what a non-artwork that from me feels like. I know what it feels to try and force something that isn't me. And I even remember when at the end of that whole present, like we put up all the work, and the teacher, so funny, she was like, I don't know why she did this, but she, for some reason, I think it was like off the cuff thing. She started talking about everyone's work, and she'd try to say something nice about everyone's work. And then eventually she gets to this one that I painted, which was categorically horrific. And she looks at it and she says, well, you tried. But what's interesting is that, you know, I think if she'd maybe delved a bit deeper, she could have realized that that is what that lesson was. And it still sits with me, because I'm like, oh, this is what inauthentic work looks like. It feels forced. And so the fact that your lecturer could look at your line work and go, Dirk is expressing from a deeper place. There's something more going on here. That's fucking powerful. And to get that like really authentic response, as opposed to, oh, those are some nice lines. What the fuck does that even mean? You know? Fascinating.
And then I think also at the same time, so shortly after, I started squatting in the building, which meant.
So just to clarify, you don't mean working out, right? You're not talking about racks of weights and doing some squats.
So living in the building illegally.
Okay. So everyone knew about this, right?
Yeah. No. It was,
so illegal, but it was kind of.
Yeah. So there were problems with the university administration, which from what I understand, staff kind of said no, like, you know, they shielded me from all of those kind of issues, and kind of allowed it to happen. But what it meant for me, one is that I disconnected from mass media, because I had then no access to kind of television. And then after class and after I had completed all my kind of assignments, like, what did I do with my free time? So what are the things that I had access to was the library, and I could then kind of start painting, like all the exploration that happened in these art courses. I then kind of started exploring on my own, and kind of tempted painting and exploring kind of painting as a medium.
So just to clarify, I mean, why did you squat? Because you're currently living at home, you know, because there's familial stuff that you're busy sorting out. So what made that space not safe for you, and why was squatting at university a better option? Like what shifted there?
So when I was in first year, we had a lecturer, Don Tyndall, and I think he was great, but he threw us in the deep end. So
what was he, a design lecturer? What was
he was a design lecturer, and ran the first year design course.
Okay.
And he had kind of was looking at theories of classicism, romanticism, and left and right brain, and never introduced what his thinking was, and just threw us in the deep end. And at a first year level, coming from, you know, high school into tertiary education, like, all of this was remarkably confusing. And what was great about it is that it was unsettling, and he marked it accordingly. So throughout the year, most, like in a project, the results of the project, there were 1 or 2 students who got like a 75 and 80, and then the rest of the class got like 30, 20, 12, 5. And
so like a properly brutal type of marking.
And which meant, like, okay, you go like, okay, I'm at a tertiary education, a tertiary institution, and I want to do this. And like when you get 20% for your project feedback and your mark, you go like, oh, I need to up my game. Like I'm clearly not catching the grade. And then you look at the people who are passing and doing fairly well, and you go, okay, I need to get to that level. And then you work your ass off, and then you get 25.
And you get like a 5% increase,
Yeah.
which in percentage points is huge, right? To go from 20 to 25%, that's like a 20% jump.
Yeah, yeah.
So fucking amazing, but it's still only 25%.
So like it in kind of on one level it kind of still the kind of panic, like I'm not coping, I'm not going to make the grade, and found working at university and then spending like an hour in traffic, getting home, and then kind of recalibrating once you're at home, and then going, okay, now I need to work, and then being at home, everyone going to sleep, like it creates a particular atmosphere, and then you're tired, and it just made me incredibly anxious. And then in order to beat the traffic, I'd get up early, and then like you get that it's like a 30-minute commute, so it's an hour that you lose, plus the kind of recalibrating in.
It's a 30-minute commute because it's then back as an hour.
Yeah. And then recalibrating like another half an hour either side. So 2 hours automatically taken out of your day. And I realized that this commuting is eating away at me, especially when you're under pressure.
Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, I need to get accommodation at Wits, so it's nice and close. And then couldn't get into res, and then looked at kind of accommodation. And at that stage, there was no student accommodation outside of res. And res was always reserved for students who were
from other far afield.
Yeah. And then looked at kind of accommodation that was available, and a lot of it was like super dodgy. And then thought, and then Peter Rich said like, he expects students to work in studio, and flippantly said like, yeah, like it would be great if people lived in the studio. And I just took that as a literal thing and moved. And because I was kind of into kind of punk as a subculture, and squatching was a theme within that subculture, I thought like,
this works perfectly.
It works perfectly. And what I found the moment I moved into, like, the one great thing about it was then like I had to build some form of accommodation, and I'd never made anything in my life. So
you actually built yourself a little room.
Exactly. So like
that you could lock.
That I could lock, and I could have a little kitchen, and that always happened in the studio, built in the space itself initially. So like in the second year studio, like with scaffolding, and then things that I could find, and then I could go to the workshop and make. And then it was always this process of like, I don't know how to do this. How do we need to fix metal to wood? How do we do this? And then I had a friend, and then between the two of us, we kind of worked this thing out and built a place to live with like a little, like in the studio, you could just get a mezzanine for like a bed space, and then a studio space, and then with whatever it means I could.
And so what's in the space? So we got like a little kitchenette space. So basically you can have 2-minute noodles, I'm imagining, that kind of vibe.
So like a little
microwave maybe, or
a stove, a fridge, a place to store your food stuffs, a place to work. So like a place where I could put in a drawing table.
But surely the studio has a drawing table already.
They had drawing tables, so I'd take a drawing table, clean it up, and then put it in my
your sub studio.
My sub studio.
Dirk studio.
And then
did you have a flag?
no flag. And then a little mezzanine where I could sleep. And then each year I would dismantle that studio and build a new one. And then because I had gained skills in making that first one, like I'd go, I can do this better. And then I'd also started accumulating materials. Like I'd collect scrap materials, and there's a piece of timber here.
And where would you find this? Would this be like stuff lying around on campus? Or?
Lying in campus, lying in the workshop. And then Jenny Stadler would always give me house sitting jobs in December, so I'd get some income
bit of cash for food
cash,
and whatever.
and then I'd use that money to buy some materials, and then I've got a larger palette to build the next version. And then in the holidays, I would dismantle what I'd built, live in Jenny Stadler's house,
Whatever she'd connected you with, hooked you up with.
And then I would go to the workshop in the holidays and build a new one. And then that was the kind of ritual that I did.
I mean, this is quite fascinating. And tell me, did you like go spend time with family, or when did that happen?
So I generally, to go back to the what this did for me is, one is like it disconnected me from mass media. Like for me, I think there's an addiction to watching TV. Growing up, always watched TV and like would watch rubbish, and it would just eat into my time. And it was a procrastination strategy. And being at varsity, one, I didn't have that medium, and it took me, there was a kind of withdrawal period where like I really, like I want this stuff, but it wasn't there. And then also this kind of commute recalibration didn't happen. So like I could do a day, I could at varsity do all the lectures, do all the tutorials, have a nap, and then I'm ready to go, and I could work till, we used to work till 12-1, go to sleep, and then wake up 10 to 8, and then at 8 o'clock get up and go to the lecture and be in the lecture. And that extra sleep I got, that extra time meant that like I always felt like I was on top of things. I was no longer chasing everything and wasting time on unnecessary. Like I could organize my life quite easily, and then kind of was quite easy to kind of move ahead of the class and do things more than other people did, because I didn't have that erasure of time. So if you say 2 hours a day extra, plus all the extra energy because you could have extra nap that other people can't, that means all of a sudden like these things are easy, where you're seeing other people struggle because they're commuting and they're tired, and then for me the moments of solitude. So when like in the back, I wouldn't see anyone.
So just to clarify, I mean, during so you have the main December break, fine, you're house sitting, but then there's obviously a June break between the semesters. That's for argument's sake, a 3-week, if I remember correctly, typically, and it depends obviously what yours was, but let's say it was 3 weeks. So those 3 weeks you remained in studio,
and then would carry on working.
So you kind of this is really powerful what you're saying, because essentially what you're describing is that. And during that break, would you kind of keep the routines more or less the same?
So I would paint. I would go to the library, take out books, look at art books. When I was living at in Jenny's place, she had a massive library.
Because she's an artist, lecturer, so she has all access to all this stuff. So because one thing that for example, when we came back after this break, we came essentially 2 days earlier we started than what we said we would start. But we had I think for argument's sake, it was an 11-day leave break plus all the weekends and holidays. So it's probably like a 3-week, not quite 3 weeks, but 20 days about. That's kind of the total break time. We came back, and that first week was basically a waste, because you're trying to figure out what this thing is called routine. And even myself, even though I kind of worked through, I still felt that it was uncomfortable. So if you, for argument's sake, and I'm not saying that rest is, you obviously were resting because you were painting and doing art and exploring and reading. So you weren't in like a very intense pressured routine, but you'd kind of kept the routine that you had established in the first and then continued in the second semester. So you would argue that you're maybe like 2 weeks, I would say, ahead in the second semester, because you're not having to recalibrate again after the break. And then almost when you then start, so you're like, for argument's sake, 2 weeks ahead in your second semester, and then the December break comes, you are doing similar stuff again. So you're basically compounding this routine that you've developed.
Yeah.
And so just to clarify, when you then finished, you're one of the top performers in the year, right?
Yeah. So compared to like the first year where everything was just an immense struggle to get through, and then all of a sudden, like from being a kind of mid-range average student to kind of being, in the top 3, 4, and that varied. So either was the top student or one of the top.
But it kept
students.
changing.
Yeah.
Depending obviously on if you kind of nailed the brief perfectly, whatever.
Exactly.
And also because architecture is subjective.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
But so you basically went from someone who is like basically just kind of making it happen, just enough to get done because of this recalibration process you're talking about. And now all of a sudden, because you have access to more time, you've got access to the right environment, you're not having this distraction of mass media, like Dragon Ball Z in my case, or computer games, then you are then definitely able to unlock more because you are just immersed in this thing the whole time. Yeah. So I mean, in your mind, did you find that? Did you kind of, because what happened with me, for instance, is that I kind of like lost who I was in a way, because I still try to do martial arts and still try to have a girlfriend and still try to play in a jazz band and I still try to do all these different things, have friends, and I kind of did everything badly basically. Until I had basically I don't know, I won't call it like a mental break, but there was a burnout period that I had where I had to split my year. I just had to fucking sit on the couch and watch TV because I was fucked. Did you find that you lost some of yourself because because one of the things that I really struggled with is this idea that you had to become an architect. You're not allowed to be, like I said, a martial artist or a jazz bander, trombone player, or whatever. You have to become single-minded. But what you're describing doesn't sound like that. Am I right?
So yes and no. So I think in that process, it was all-encompassing, and my friends always complained, like, we don't see you. They'd visit me every once in a while. And
when you say friends, you mean school friends or do you mean varsity friends?
Varsity friends. So
okay.
I had friends who were my friends from long-standing friends who were at varsity at the same time as me.
Oh.
And I like they kept always complaining, like, we don't see you. They'd come a couple of times to studio to visit, but that also then slowly diminished. And for me, it wasn't something that I was losing who I was. I was discovering this whole other realm that was absolutely fascinating and was completely subsumed and immersed in that culture. And that culture, not being one of people around me, it was pretty much one of solitude, of exploring and discovering this stuff on my own and just loving it.
And did you? I mean, before this, were you very solid? Were you quite a loner before, or was this something that actually like you uncovered as you went through this kind of, let's call it a metamorphosis, because that's kind of what it is, right?
So I think so when I was in primary school, like I had a group of friends, and when I went to high school. So I went to school in Midrand in Halfway House.
Yeah.
And they had just completed a new school. So all my friends went to this newly completed school. And I had an older brother who was in what used to be the feeder school. And because my older brother was there, my parents didn't want to, the one was in Centurion, the other one was in Wendywood, and they didn't want to, split. So they said, you're going to go to the school. And so I went to this high school. One, for me, was a culture shock because all of a sudden I was in this highly militaristic, conservative environment, and everyone there had their own friend circle. So like I had no friends. I was an outsider. I didn't like the culture that I was in.
Yeah.
And because it was like Johannesburg, Pretoria cultures, like I felt out of place, and then went through high school very alienated of that situation. I always like was begging for my parents that I could go with my friends. And
did you remain in contact with your friends?
I remained in contact with my friends, but then at school, like, it was always very awkward, and And
Yeah, you miss out because you're not there, so you don't know. Like most of the school friends happen because of school.
Exactly.
If you're not in school together, you're not actually friends.
Yeah. So
okay, so the loner thing had kind of established itself in high school.
Yes.
And then in varsity, you perpetuated, not in a bad way. You just kind of were like, actually, I need to be making these steps to become the kind of person that I want to be. And you're also exploring this thing. So there's a journey of self-discovery that's occurring here.
Yeah, but I think the way that you explain it tends to be something that someone who has insight. Like the way these things happened were very organic, and like in a way there's a inner drive that's curating this thing, but it's not a conscious thing. And the one thing for me that was a revelation is like it was only my third year. One of the tutors said, like, don't you ever get lonely? And like it struck me, like, lonely, like
what do you mean?
I didn't understand that by being by yourself the whole time that one would get lonely. And that was a revelation to me that this isn't something that everyone can do, because people are social and
because, and I'm not to say you're not social, right? I don't consider you a non-social person.
But I think my experience with going to this high school, and like I had friends there, but I was, they would in the afternoons they would go visit each other, but because I lived in Midrand, like I had no connection to them, so I'd only see them at school, and then there's this kind of awkwardness, and like somehow I'd gotten used to it, and then when I was in varsity and started squatting, like I didn't pick it up that it was an issue. It seemed like, I've done this most of my life at that stage, and then kind of ran with it.
It's fascinating because I had a very similar high school experience that you're describing, where I felt I felt really uncomfortable there, even though I'm still friends with some people from that time.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is an artist, the other one, so they also, her mother was a big singer and her father was a photographer. So she's also in that kind of milieu of being an artist to some level. So automatically as an artist, you're an outsider. Like it's just the way it is. So I kind of, those were my like really good mates. And obviously there were others. But my point is that when I went to varsity, I did the exact opposite of what you did. I dialed up my warmth cues to the fucking 10th degree, and I became the most friendly, kind, generous, just love me, And I was so happy to be in that space where there was people that I could actually have a conversation with. It was interesting. And what's fascinating is how, some of the friends that I made in that first year are still absolutely one of my best friends now, and I'm still really in good contact with them, and we're constantly connecting. And it's just fascinating to me how it's the same thing, that like feeling like an outsider. It's not a foregone conclusion that it would have continued. Mm-hmm. It could have gone the other direction.
Yeah.
Or like what And I mean, there's also like a lot of unpacking there, like in terms of like trauma stuff and whatever that's come out of that subsequently. But it's just fascinating to me, how you think it's just, oh no, this is obviously this would happen, but not necessarily. It's because it's you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell me, so. You then worked in this space. Was there a gap year in this process, or was it still 1 degree all the way through?
So there was a gap year. So in my degree, it was 4 years, a gap year, and then
2 years.
And then 2 years.
But it was 1 degree, eh? It was a bachelor's.
No. It was 2 degrees. So it was a bachelor's of architecture, and then a bachelor of architectural studies, and then a bachelor of architecture.
Oh, okay.
But so in that DNA, I think there were 2 important things. So the one was speaking about the influence of Sally Gall and Jenny Stadler.
Yeah.
As thinking out of the box, like radically thinking out of the box, really looking at the world around you.
Yeah.
And then because I was making use of the workshop, and the guy who ran the workshop, Peter Kelsey, he was a craftsman, and because I was always there, he kind of gave me a lot more leeway than he gave other people. And because I was spending so much time, I also saw the things that he made. And learned a great deal of watching him do things, and started to understand processes. But then also because like I was making everything, I would then start attempting to design furniture to live with, as well as the little buildings that I was building. Learning how to detail up things.
Because you were essentially becoming a craftsperson.
So learning how to make.
Because you were doing essentially two sides of this thing, which is architecture. You were learning the theory, the big kind of concepts, how to design in a technical or theoretical way, then grounding that using constructive techniques that you learn in a book that you kind of apply to a drawing. But then on the opposite side of the spectrum, you were literally going, how do I join these two pieces of wood using dovetailing, using dowels and carpentry techniques? And then, because you were doing these two extremes and you were bringing them together, your kind of understanding was like leapfrogging, I would imagine.
Yeah,
is that right?
Exactly. And they weren't these abstract things, because and each year the thing that I built got more complex and complicated. And the last thing that I built was it was 3 stories up, essentially, in the roof space. So I had to deal with structure and.
Wait, hold on. Which year is this now?
So that was in third year.
Okay.
I built a thing in the back end of the studio in the stairwell. There's a barrel vault, and I built a floor on the bottom of that, and then closed it up and built ladders to get up there, and had this beautiful view of the Brixton Tower, and it was this amazing, beautiful space. But then also had detailed up, like everything I'd learned in architectural construction. I detailed up these very beautiful, the way this thing sat together, very Japanese in its nature, and had kind of, built scaffolding and to get up to that level, and built it in the holidays. So, each year also got more sophisticated and
I mean, for argument's sake, you're doing like parasitic architecture, right? That's what this is. Yeah. You have this existing building, and you're putting in this parasite that now plugs into whatever's there, but you're doing it all on your own. I'm assuming there was no structural engineer that was involved in helping you with this, and you were like, that feels good. I'm going to rely on that. So it was a sense body. Mm-hmm. So you had an intuitive. You probably had rule of thumbs that you could use to kind of go. A beam needs to be this thick to span this wide.
So yes and no. So those conversations happened with Peter, and like
Peter being Peter Rich.
Peter Kelsey, the workshop guy. And like I'd ask him, like, would this be enough? And he says, like, I don't know. Let's test it. And then we'd put things up, and then kind of span, and then would load it, and then it says, well, you can see how this is kind of deflecting. So what are you going to do? You can do this, you can do that, and then we'd kind of beef it up, and then like test it and load it, and go like, okay, that's better.
So for argument's sake, you were working in the way that craftsmen of the 1500s and prior, obviously, would work.
Yeah,
it would be an embedded practical knowledge. A beam this big can span this wide because we've tested it with these amounts of weights, and we know that my weight is this, and I can then stand on this thing, and it is fine. I mean, this is fascinating, Dirk, because I didn't realize this is what you did, right? So this is all like really new to me. And what I find fascinating is that one of the things that I've realized with new people coming into the kind of studio, into Black Sable, and is this idea of like rule of thumbs. Like, how do you know, without being an engineer, how big a beam needs to be? And people are like, well, I'm not an engineer. Like, yeah, well, you're not an engineer. But yet we still need to represent something until we get an engineer on board. And we need to do it in a way that it is reasonable. It could work. It might not be the right solution, might not be the best solution, might not be the most efficient solution, but it is reasonable. And so this is where the rule of thumbs come in. This is where this embodied knowledge comes in. Like, how do you now, without having this information, how do you establish the knowledge that you can then use? And you just used your kind of, wherewithal, your operating mindset. Because I would argue that, okay, I don't want to go into that. Like you're an operator, but that's an whole other thing. Okay, so I mean that's super fascinating. And so then the third year you did this, and then you in fourth year you did again. What is fourth year?
Because I'd built this quite a beautiful space,
Have you got photos of this stuff?
Sorry,
have you got photos of this?
I've got one photo of me taking one of the units down, and that's it.
That's mad. Could you draw it? Like from memory, like a perspective?
Yeah, I could draw them.
Dude.
That would actually be a nice...
Dude, I would love to see these.
Uh-huh.
Because I think
there are still traces. So like if you go in the studio, you can see like on the roof where the building was joined up. So there's like a bit of a footprint. And with the new building so when I had left varsity, they then had problems. At that stage, campus wasn't secured. So then they had other people coming in and then coming into the building and then living in there that weren't part of the university or the school and were stealing from the studio. So then they tore those things down. But they had repainted the stairwell and then they'd repainted it green and then it used to be white. So everywhere my space was, you could see like where all the brackets were, and they left all of that until this new renovation. So there was always these traces of like the ghost of where this place used to be.
So you like haunted the studio, Dirk? Is that what those voices were that I was hearing? Oh, that's so weird. Man, that's so cool. You know what I find also interesting is that, I don't know when Peter Rich and Sally Gall kind of lectured, when they started rather, but I didn't realize there was actually this overlap between you and me. Like Colin Savage, I'm assuming, was also one of your lecturers. I didn't realize there was this overlap between you and me, that even though, because I graduated in 2015 and you graduated in 2002. 2000. So, I mean, that's a 15-year gap between us. Oh, look, I also started earlier. So there's a 10-year gap. But that we shared these similar lecturers. You kind of mentioned Sally Gall and Jenny, I think it was, Stedler, being instrumental in your artistic expression. Who would you say was instrumental in your architectural expression, and why? What did they do that made you go, I can do this thing?
So I think what was pivotal in my architectural degree is that when in first year we had no studio culture, essentially, and then
what is studio culture?
I'll maybe describe what we had.
Okay.
So in my second year, there was one student, Nazim, who would kind of always work in studio. He was a little bit more mature than the rest of us, and would work in studio. And then because I was squatting, then all of a sudden there were two people that were always in studio. And that slowly, because there were always people there, then other people said like, oh, well, I'll come work with you guys. And slowly that grew to a kind of a core group. And then because I was squatting, mainly students who were older, at that stage, they had kind of lockable rooms. They went, well, if he can squat, why do I have to pay rent? I can just take one of these rooms and live there. And there were 1, 2, 3, kind of 4 or 5 people living in the building 24/7. And then by the time kind of second, third year, every day there were about 14 or 15 people in my year working in the studio till 12, 1 at night. We had workers together as a group, but then there were obviously within the group there was kind of subgroups of friends.
Yeah.
But then what it meant was that, like, first of all, like, when things get tough and you're tired and you're pushing for the deadline, like this group made it all fun. So like we'd have a break and we'd mess around,
talk shit a bit,
and that was enjoyable. And there was a camaraderie.
Yeah, that's a hard word.
that happened, and it just made this whole process enriching. So like every I don't know, it was a Tuesday or Wednesday night, we'd have a bunny chow night. So like we'd make bunny chow and then invite all the other years. So then we got to know the other years. And then every Friday we'd have field trips. So all the other years we'd go visit a building. And then for me, what was really great, like being in second year, all of a sudden you're speaking to someone's in thesis and you're having a conversation with them on a higher level than you have access to, and they're explaining, urban design and you're going, but I don't understand what you mean here. Whereas those kind of conversations you couldn't have with a lecturer, because you'd feel stupid because you're revealing your ignorance, and you couldn't question things because you didn't feel
You weren't peers.
You weren't peers.
Even though there is a hierarchy because they're in masters and whatever, the fact that you're both students, you're both in this journey, and you're on a Friday, so it's chilled, it's relaxed vibes.
Exactly.
Now you're going out and having an experience, or inherently it's going to be more galvanizing and more kind of cohesive.
And that group, as a group of students, were quite diverse. So like you'd have someone like myself who like looked strange.
How did you, we say look strange, like dreadlocks, piercings, tattoos, what?
No, so at that stage it was, I had shaved my hair, but I had like these long tufts, like two tufts that hang down, and they was dyed different colors. At that stage I had lots of facial piercings that at that stage was radical.
Yeah.
Like
now it's like very kind of whatever,
very
commonplace. Same as like tattoos
Yeah.
in the 70s, 80s, 90s were very, whoa, that's super weird.
and straight away kind of ostracized you. You were
deemed as another, like you don't fit in. You're
exactly. So within that social circle, like there were people who were conservative Muslims, or and people who came from the white middle class suburbia, people who came from Attridgeville working class areas, who also, due to the time period of it was kind of just 1994, so
there was a massive political change. The regime had ended, white minority rule had ended, and it became democratic states.
Yeah. So, but the people of color who were in my class, they were also outsiders because they were a minority. They're coming into a very white university, so they also felt disenfranchised as outsiders.
Yeah.
But within that social grouping, it was so diverse that, like, being the strange punk, like we'd kind of in these field trips, part of the field trips was also kind of visiting other people's houses and talking about the context that they came from. And for me it was quite fascinating. Like, those communities took me in without going like, "Ooh, this guy looks weird," and there was a sense of acceptance. And I in that kind of radical diversity, I think there was also a great deal of learning that happened on a kind of social level of different contexts where people come from, different environments,
frameworks and ways of being and cultural systems that they're coming from. And
especially coming from, a kind of a white middle class background in apartheid South Africa, I didn't have access to. And all of a sudden I was exploring all these other worlds, these other ways of being, these other cultures that were...
And that's because you kind of, I don't want to use this word other because it has other connotations, but essentially you had explored the version of you that isn't a white suburban male from the 80s.
Yeah.
And so because you had embraced this other, this part of yourself that was different to that mold, you became accepted and was deemed as a part of the tribe of this kind of more ostracized group.
Yeah,
if you will.
Like the
non-traditional in that context, in that time.
Yeah,
like it's very temporal focused. Okay, so that's really interesting. And so you kind of, I don't know where we were going. Oh, we were discussing studios culture.
Yeah. So what that meant was that. One, we were always working together, and would, like, when you get stuck, you'd get crit from your peers, and you would critique their work, which means that looking at work and being, okay, what's wrong with this? Why doesn't this feel good? You learned that vocalization. And then it was then you had that feedback from more advanced students, and that happened like every night. When you got stuck, you'd have a crits, maybe twice an evening, and you'd talk about someone else's work, and it would happen across years. And then, at the end of the year, I'd help the that stage, the kind of final year students with their presentations. So you get exposed to the work that they're doing, you get exposed to the projects that you're doing. And that is a culture, for me, in terms of architecture, is where I learned everything. The lecturers, in a way, were peripheral. They were the people that generated the projects, evaluated the projects at the end, but the learning happened in studio with each other, with trying to kind of navigate those complexities of the project, and then also seeing how someone else, because you're working side by side in parallel, you taking this route, they're taking this route, but you're seeing how these routes unfold and how people make certain decisions, and you go like, ooh, I got here, I don't really like this. That's a really beautiful project and a really beautiful way of conceptualizing. But rather than just seeing the finalization of it, you party to that evolution. So
you're not just seeing the end product going, wow, that's so amazing.
Yeah.
You see all the pitfalls and the mistakes and the roads less traveled, and you see all those things that happen. They go, you know what, that thing took them so long to get to that you have even more of an appreciation for what they've achieved. Mm-hmm. At the same time as also going, this is not as easy as it looks, and it is easy as it looks.
Yeah. And also,
it's not mysterious, I guess. That's the the mystery of the product is kind of removed.
Exactly.
And so because you have that inherent embodied knowledge of what actually happened, you can start going, well, let me almost, you're kind of absorbing lessons without necessarily knowing that you're absorbing lessons.
Exactly.
And what's happening is that you're going, Jonathan got to X. I loved X. I don't want to get to X, but I want to use the same methodology that I used to get to X, because that's going to mean that I'm going to get somewhere close to X for whatever it may be.
Yeah. And I think also that there's a range of personality types.
Yeah.
So, and by observing those processes, like there was one student, Ian Stewart, who was obsessed with how, like the fine grained details. So like in a project, he'd design, okay, so this is, like when you get to the front door, this is where you scrape the mud off your shoe, and this is where you put your keys.
Okay.
And I was and would have these narratives on how these things worked, which no one else in the class did. And because he was working side by side and would tell us these stories, this is where this happens, you can go, oh, that's right. It's a really wonderful way of looking at things, and you take that thinking on board in your own practice. And I think what was really nice in that process, cool. So if you were working at home, you develop one type of thinking, and that's the way that you work. But in studio, you're seeing 6 or 7 processes
unfolding at the same time.
And you're learning from those methodologies and those ways of looking at the world, even though you're trying to develop your own way of thinking. And if I reflect back, all of those students, their ways of being, their ways of thinking, their ways of approaching it, like have been joined together as a learning curve on how to do architecture, rather than saying like, this lecturer taught me about architecture. So when we're in our third year...
This is fascinating.
We had Heinrich Kammer, and he was great because he was also a kind of maverick, and he encouraged all of this and was quite incendiary and radical in the way he structured the year, which we...
What was he? Was he a design lecturer?
He was a design lecturer. Okay. So he had this kind of thing, we're not going to do any marks in the studio, which for us at that time was quite radical.
No marks.
No marks. We'll mark you at the end of the year, but there are no marks. And we took all of that to heart, and he would tell us all these inspiring students of when he was a student and the things that they did. And in our final exams, we said, like, and because we'd been working together, we said, like, we're not interested in being evaluated from outside by other people, and we don't want to see being evaluated individually. We work together as a group. We learn from each other as a group. There were kind of logistics that everyone was marked together, but we kind of saw it more of a performance. But the kind of ethos of it is that we as a collective learn from each other and produced work together and saw ourselves as learning and essentially growing with each other. And that was how we wanted to be examined. And that was the studio culture that emerged out of that whole process.
I mean, you know what I find absolutely astounding hearing this, Dirk, is that, like, let's think about what an architect is, right? They're in many ways a profession, like a doctor, like an accountant, like an attorney. That's what they are in a societal construct. And then you tell me these fucking insane stories about the massive counterculture movement that was taking place when you were studying. And I think it's also to do with the time that South Africa, where it was in its kind of narrative, that this was such a thing. But if you had told me, for example, like, doctors were doing, we don't want to get marked. We want to be assessed as a group because we've all learned together. We've all studied together. I mean, maybe that it happens, but I can't imagine that being the thing. And what you so clearly illustrated is the difference between architects and or engineers, even like architects and these other professions. Is that, yes, we're a profession, but there is this fucking strong rebellion streak that exists for whatever reason. That's what, I mean, if you look at also in the past, like, when does the role of an architect become apparent? It's like Michelangelo was an architect, and I don't know if Da Vinci designed buildings, but, these are at the top of my head. They're artists, and yet they design buildings. And it's almost like, it's not to say that we want to be artists designing buildings, because there's things around that to me are also very problematic. You don't want to be an artist designing buildings. You want to be an architect designing buildings. But at the same time, this rebelliousness and this idea to wanting to kind of push what it means to create these amazing spaces. Like, how do you, otherwise everything just becomes cookie cutter, right? Like, that's kind of, that creative need, that urge, that rebelliousness is very important to kind of create amazing buildings.
And so I think what was great with that studio culture was that it was embedded in a questioning. It was a questioning of everything, questioning of society, questioning how we come together, questioning who we are, questioning culture. And those things in studio were things that were discussed openly. There wasn't any kind of taboo of, like now there's so much complexity about, cultural appropriation and, critical race theory and like who you are and where you fit in this whole thing. There it was just a whole bunch of people with different backgrounds being thrown together and then going like, where you come from is radically different from where I come from. Let's check it out. And
it wasn't so like focused on trying to slot you into a box. It was more just kind of being together.
Exactly. And being together in diversity and questioning everything, questioning, so like there were discussions of politics and, the kind of, the kind of group dynamics was that everything was discussed, everything was questioned, everything was open, everyone was helping each other and supporting each other in whatever way that they could. Like in their exam timetables, like, okay, so in my second year, there was a person working in the studio. So, okay, so in the exam table, you first on the exams. So I will give you 4 days where we'll work through the night and put your exam exhibition together, which doesn't really happen, but we kind of built little curated exhibitions. And then when we finished with you, then there's another 4 sleepless nights where you'll kind of support me. And that kind of sense of kind of support and
Oh, wow.
working together again meant that, like now you the boss, I'm your support.
I'm hands, yeah.
So you begin to understand the kind of logic of how this is coming together. And then the roles reverse. Okay, now I'm the boss, I'm the curator, and these are the decisions that have to happen under my kind of leadership. And those kind of roles were massive learning curves for me. Which,
You know what's interesting to me, because I'm just kind of thinking, like, this is fundamentally the benefit here is that you are learning how to artistic direct, right? To creatively direct. Which if you work in a studio, like that's what I'm doing with my team the whole time, and they're doing with me. I'll design something and I'll be like, guys, what do you think of this? And they're like, I don't know, that looks a bit weird, or this is feeling strange. And at first you might like, it's fine, and then you'll sit with it a bit longer and you're like, oh, they're actually right, that's not working. And so what's strange to me is that even though we're all remote, we've kind of built this studio culture where there is this melding of ideas. Everyone can say what they need to say. It's not the boss and his lackeys. It's much more kind of it's changing depending on who it is, in the sense what role you're playing. So, for example, if I'm designing a building or designing a space or whatever it is, I will talk to Priyan, who's has been with us for a year now. He's fresh out of varsity from 2023. He graduates, he's been with us for a year now, and I'll get feedback from him, like, okay, what do you think, Priyan? Is this working? He's like, oh, I don't know about this isn't working, maybe think about that, or whatever it may be. Whereas it's not this top down, I am the architect, you're my hands. And so what's interesting is that because in this world that you're describing, where at first you are the curator and the other person is the implementer, or partial implements, you're obviously both implementing, and then that role switches. This is exactly what's happening in this kind of Black Sable space. So it's fascinating to me, like what sparks that? What makes that kind of happen? Obviously, like this mutual respect and all these other things. That's really cool, and it's fascinating how that like links to the real world. You can. Because one of the big, I've got a massive chip on my shoulder around the way architects are trained, and to me, what you're describing now much closer emulates what the real world feels like than someone telling you some random idea. You're going into isolation, designing some random thing, presenting it, and getting a mark.
Yeah. So, and I think that's also why. So the teaching staff, they saw what was happening and were well aware of it. Like, so Heinrich would often come and sit with us on the couch and just hang out.
The lecturer.
The lecturer.
The course runner who's running the course.
Yeah.
Essentially, for argument's sake, in this narrative, he's the boss that you need to please.
Yeah.
And he'd come sit on the couch with you.
You'd come and sit on the couch, and like those bunny chow nights, you'd sometimes come and
he would come do bunny chow with you.
Sorry?
He would do bunny chow with you.
We would sit and have and then carry
Beautiful.
on. The teaching staff, so that it got to a stage where a lot of people living in the building, and obviously all of this is illegal. The university administration, that they don't want this kind of stuff. But they said, like, this is what, and I only learned this subsequently, is that they shielded the administration from eroding this, and they're saying, this is what we want this kind of culture, and encourage the culture, but left us to do our own thing. And all these things that emerged felt organic, natural, but also were kind of pivotal in my architectural education. The ability to evaluate, the ability to self-motivate, the ability to work together with people, learn from other people, and then being creative, having a need to be creative and making things. And then because I was then constantly making things and failing at making things, trying to build a coffee table, and then spending a lot of time and effort, and then it wobbles and going, the problems in the design. One, I built up skills that other people didn't have.
Yeah.
But then also meant I was now interested in being creative with my making skills. And then with the APSA Atelier, I then started entering that as a competition.
And to be fair, that is an artistic art competition.
Exactly.
And it is for an amateur artist, if I remember correctly.
There is
what I mean is you can't be signed by you can't be a William Kentridge entering APSA Atelier.
It had a age restriction.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if there might have been a condition you're not allowed to have a solo exhibition.
Okay. So you couldn't be as established as that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for me, the way it works is you submit work. That work, if it gets chosen, goes into a regional selection, and then the regional selections gets exhibited, and then they pick out work for a final exhibition. If I remember correctly, that's how it worked. And then there was a process of kind of submitting work, it being rejected, and then you go, okay, the work didn't make it. How do I make better work? And then the work going in.
And to be fair, we're not talking about architecture now. We're talking about art.
We're talking about fine art.
And before we, so you're going straight into this. I'm like, I want to know more about this. When did you? Okay, so you kind of had this obsession with art, painting. Sally and Jenny had kind of sparked this. When did you start going? Okay, were you working and then you're like, I actually want to be an artist, or when did that?
No. So someone had invited me to do a curator from Canada had invited me to do something for a in situ exhibition in the Johannesburg Art Gallery.
Okay.
And because I could make things, I then made something for that exhibition. And that kind of sparked I can make things for the art world as well.
Okay, so there was a catalyst that occurred that made you go, oh, actually, this is also applicable to the art world.
Yeah.
And because those lines weren't as defined as, for example, for me, those lines are quite defined. Because there was a blurring, it didn't take much for you to go, oh, I can do this.
Yeah.
I can make art.
Yeah.
Hey, was that kind of the switch?
Yeah. So the project I did. So it was what was the project called? It was a young curator. So they weren't looking at established names. They were just looking for artists to contribute to this project. And it essentially the exhibition was to leave all the existing work and insert work about the area in between the existing work.
So it was like parasitic art.
Exactly. And what I did is I built a large sheet of glass on wheels.
Okay.
And then wheeled it into the city, and then behind the glass would trace as the city would occur, and then people would come and watch, and then I'd trace them while they're looking at me, and then they'd move away, and then I'd start tracing something else on the glass, and then would trace cars moving through, and spent the day tracing the life of the city, and then that got wheeled in front of another artwork in the gallery, and then there's this kind of layering of the life of the city on these classic
yeah, that makes sense.
And then that technique I try to kind of develop and did a number of iterations, and then entered the APSA Atelier competition.
So after having gone through this process, you then realized there's something here. Then you started exploring with it, iterating on it, design essentially.
Yeah.
And then you kind of got to a point you're like, oh, this is actually starting to be good. There was this competition. You decided, I'm going to fucking enter. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
And so it was a action-orientated gut response not going to make something perfect. I'm just going to test the system. Let's just fucking make this thing happen. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Okay, so then you submitted, and then
So then what was wonderful about that learning curve is like you make the work in the studio and you go like, this is really good. This is really powerful.
Yeah.
And then you put it into a gallery in amongst people who are experienced in this world. So a lot of artists, graduate artists,
refined eyes, refined sensibilities,
and then you see like how your work compares. Like what has presence? Where does the presence disappear? How do you hold presence? What other people have done in order to kind of elevate that work, to hold someone's attention, and then then it's a kind of trial and error. Okay, like I've seen my work, I can see like it doesn't have the presence of this kind of work that appeals to me, or the kind of winning projects. What do I need to do?
just talk to me about presence. So when you say presence of work, now I know we're going into a world that is hard to describe. It's hard to kind of pinpoint what this word means.
Yeah.
But if it's like lightly describe, what does presence, when you see a work, let's say you have two works next to each other, and one is presence, one does not. What is happening that you can feel the difference between these two?
Okay, so I think Jenny Stadler was great at this. Okay, so like,
because I know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
I know I've walked past paintings, and there's for some reason that one Pollock speaks to me.
Yeah.
That one Rothko speaks to me. There's something that's happening that I'm like, fuck, that has fucking presence.
Exactly.
But what is that to you?
So
sorry, Jenny
with kind of under kind of Jenny's presence, like this kind of mark making, kind of splashing paint, gluing something on. There's no inherent beauty in it, and in the kind of life drawing, like I try to not represent the person but would try and do things that it was a gestural mark here, that somehow captured that person's being.
Okay.
But then at what point do you stop? When do you say like this is the finished thing?
Yeah.
Especially when there isn't like a drawing where you can see the resemblance, where you can see like, this thing now looks like this particular object.
Or let's make it more concrete. It's not a maths equation that gets solved.
Exactly.
The sides or an accounting thing, this is now balanced. Everything that the world, or in a medical sense, this person has been healed. They had a heart problem. They no longer have a heart problem. 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah. Okay.
And in our world, in this world specifically, compared, in the artistic world, that does not exist.
Yeah.
It's not even on the table, right?
Yeah. So if one says like in your perception,
yeah,
obviously your perception isn't neutral. When you experience the world, your attention goes to particular things.
Yeah.
And why those particular things? And then there are things that you come across in the world that have gravity. You come to them and they move you in some kind of way. And that could be clothing, it could be a particular music that you go, this song is like, it rocks. You don't know what it is, but it's something that within that neutral background comes forward and says like, I'm something of value and I appeal to you. And you could argue it's tapping into subconscious archetypes. It's got a particular energy that aligns with your being, your personality,
your spirit, whatever.
So when making an artwork, when do you stop? Like, do you make a mark, you go, that's really beautiful, but it's not quite there. It has a presence, it has an energy, it has something fascinating, but it's not. And then you make another mark and go, that's eroded that. And you try and build something that has, like, you go, like, something in this combination, like if I...
Do you think it's a fear response? Because that's what I kind of find is like I'm afraid to make another mark. And then I'm like, okay.
For me, it's like, especially with this kind of abstract expressionism, there's a moment of magic happens. Like all of a sudden these things, like they hold together and they have an energy that goes, oh, there's something.
There's like a tension that's occurring.
Yeah, and it's something magical. And that magical, there's a presence there. Like like when I put all these things together on the table,
Yeah.
like something in that combination like comes alive. And when you do this again and again, you recognize that motion, that notion of the things sparked. And then
It's kind of like a fire, right? Like it's like you stacking the wood, like, because I like making fires. And there's a moment that happens when you go, oh, it's caught.
yeah.
And you can't quantify it exactly. You know, you might use firelighters, or you might use timber, or you might use kindling, or whatever. It doesn't really matter, because there's a point when you go, it's now taken.
Yeah.
And now I don't have to worry about it. It's doing its thing now. And it's like that, hey?
So the beautiful thing then was making work, going, this thing has a presence. Like
It's doing that thing for you?
And it's doing it for me.
Okay.
And like in my studio, like, this is amazing.
Okay.
And then putting in a gallery, and then all of a sudden, like, it's disappeared. It's eroded. It's disappeared. That magic, that aura that it had. And then you look at someone else's work and you go like, hey, it's there in their work. They've managed to hold it. What had they done to hold that presence? And then it's, the way it's displayed, the nature of the work, and you go, okay, I've learned from that. And then you go back to the way that you make things, and you go, okay, I understand how they've done it. Now, how do I hold that presence in my own work? And then you make a new work, and then like seeing these different contexts on how the work changes, and how you then kind of like make this thing like those light boxes.
Yes.
I've had them in galleries that have been completely closed, and the audience would spend time with them and study them and like really for me
and be
like
engaged with it.
And generally in exhibitions, like people walk through and they work out. Now I've had exhibitions where like in the environment, people would come and would spend 20, 30 minutes on a work, and then like sit down and then watch the others. And it was really beautiful. And I've had them at like an art fair where the environment erodes the work, and people like didn't even look at the work. Like they just walked past it, and
It meant nothing.
It had no presence, no aura, and then realized various different situations hold work differently, and have made enough work where I know that work has immense value and magic, but have had it in context where the work it's meaningless.
Dirk, can I just say what you're describing now? So I had the privilege of going to Villa Savoy in France, and what's okay? That's I'm gonna ground that story. Did we switch teams?
Yeah, I saw
Yeah. That's not what. Okay, so what you're describing is the same as a building, right? If you go to a building at a certain time of day, it won't do anything for you. It's not the right time to be experienced in that building.
Exactly.
The architect, the designer, that just wasn't what, like for example, I imagine when I go to sites, if I'm there in a particular time of day, I'm going to be designing for that particular time of day. So if I arrive, we say it's like fucking hot, 12 o'clock, you are boiling on site, it's humid, it's, there's no shade, all of these things. You're designing a building for that space, for that time. And then you build this thing, you design this thing, you embed it into this location. And what you don't realize is that, okay, in that time, in that space, it feels weird. It don't feel weird. You know it in that time. It's dealing with the issues of that time. And then what happens is you arrive, if I can say, we finished this building last year. It's a spa in a lodge. And I'd gone to site again in midday. It was hot. There wasn't a lot of shade. And I designed a very, very like dark, not a lot of windows, very kind of secluded. And spas tend to be that, should be that kind of space anyway, the way I kind of conceptualize them. But I then visited this building, in magic hour in the evening when the sun was setting. And it was like a new building. I was like, oh my God, look at all this sunlight coming through, and look at the reflections. And all the stuff I had not considered at all. Like this, it was a new build, it was a new experience, kind of conceptualizing this building. And it's exactly like, I was like, fuck, this thing has presence, man. This is a very cool, feels like guttural and powerful and nothing to what it feels like when you arrive at like 12 o'clock going, oh, I'll book a spa treatment now, and the irony is that no guests will experience it at that time because they're all in game drive, which is the fucking tragedy of it. It's like this really atmospheric space that just is not happening. Going back to Villa Savoy, so there's another thing I want to just quickly. So Villa Savoy, you've been to it? I mean, So my memories of it is that I took this train ride, I bought a cheap metro ticket, not realizing that I can't go as far as I can on that line. I went all the way to the end of the line, tried to swipe out, didn't work. So I was like, oh shit. And then there was a guy next to me, just jump the turnstile. I was like, Viva la France, So I jumped across and then made my way to Villa Savoy. And it's such a weird building because, first of all, if that building was in a so you this is what I remember. Maybe my memory is a bit blurry here, but I remember going through essentially like a perimeter wall of trees, and then walking into essentially a big lawn, and the building is kind of isolated in that. So it's essentially completely surrounded by greenery, and it's like immaculate, like curated lawn, and there's no shrubs or anything. It's just a flat lawn, and it's I think it's plane trees, and then they have they've got the stems all the way around, and then they the kind of the French like cutting the tree in a certain very kind of curated box kind of shape. So it wasn't like bushy. It was do you also remember? So my memory is kind of helping you. And so you walk at this building and you look at this thing, and at first I was like, I don't know where to go in. Like it's just one blank facade. There's nothing that kind of comes out that says, hey, this is where you come in. So I kind of walked all the way around trying to figure, I was still not sure, where do I go in? And eventually I clicked, it's at the back end from where I'd entered. Come into this building and then go through the whole building experience. But the funny thing is that building, the memory of it is so profound because it is surrounded by this context. It has been given presence by what is surrounding it. And the tragedy is that I think a lot of architects look at this building and go, ooh, I'm going to design my Villa Savoy. And then they design it and they put it next to another building and next to another building. And there's no fucking presence. And you just look at this thing, it's just like, oh, it's just another modernist, wank, basically. Because it doesn't have, it's not, what is the staging of it is wrong.
Exactly.
It's not staged. It's like this light is beautiful at night. It's a stunning light. During the day, it's like, it's whatever. It's a lot of light. It's not doing much.
So, I mean, this ties in beautifully to the PhD.
Oh, okay.
So, like learning about these presences. And the difficulty in articulating them is then kind of like exploring notions of atmosphere. So what is this presence? What is the presence between people? What is the presence of a building? What is a presence of a particular situation? Like if there's a trauma situation, there's a particular presence that one feels. And those are then kind of atmospheres, or have been theorized as kind of very particular atmospheres. So now there's a word in which you can start describing these atmospheric qualities and theorizing about these atmospheric qualities. And the thing that I found in that studio culture, those field trips that we did to buildings, is that like in university situation, you get shown buildings, and then you go into a building and it's nothing like the buildings you've been shown. Like we used to have endless slideshows of people describing buildings. And then would in those field trips go and visit Joan Era's buildings. And then all realize these things have spatial connotations. These have atmospheric connotations. These things have material connotations, that the particular combinations of materials, the particular colors, the context, like you talking about, the way it's staged, it's primed, all of these create very particular feelings that when I went back to the drawing board, I was like, I want to design something that feels like that. And then would take those lived experiences and design around them as a kind of atmospheric process, but then also that art process of trying to understand presences. How do I build more of those presences into my artwork, but how do I bring those presences back into architecture? And then the PhD is like, all of these things are highly esoteric, very difficult to explain. How do you teach that? How do you show other people these kind of presences, these atmospheres? How do you talk about those things that you cannot, or as Wittgenstein says, those things that we pass over in silence?
Oh, that's well said, Em. I mean, the thing that like kind of blows my brain a little bit here is that this idea that an atmosphere, an experience is so embedded, right? It is so you going to the thing to feel the thing. Like just to like my kind of grounding language is typically food. Like I can show you photographs of the food, and I can show you a recipe of how it is put together, and I can tell you where the ingredients are sourced. I can tell you how they are sourced, and I can tell you about, like, for example, let's say it's a particular type of wine that comes from a certain region that has a bit of a dryness or acidity, and I can explain it perfectly to you. And if you have the most incredible imagination, you can visualize all of these incredible textures and temperatures and flavors and all these things combining and creating this amazing meal. But it is absolutely fuck all compared to eating it, to tasting this thing, to making it in part of you and embodying it.
Yeah.
And that so clearly describes the failure that is language, right? Or representation, any kind of representation.
Yeah.
So I mean, because I have distinct memories of. So for example, when I went to Villa Savoy, going back, I mean, it's funny this comes up again. Like going back to Villa Savoy, the thing that blew me away was firstly that it was colorful. The inside is colorful. It's not fucking gray and white and blue and what is it? Gray and white, basically. The wood has a color to it. He painted the walls like greens and blues and reds, and because all the buildings are represented in black and white, the photographs, all architects are like, oh, it must be black and white. It's like, but it's not. This guy fucking used color. Yeah. You know, and there's anathema or this fear aversion towards using color. It was like, no, but that's not what that was. It's because we haven't gone to the building. You know, and if we represented it in color, and also for some reason, I don't know why this is, but the photographs of it don't represent the rooms that were color painted. You know, when there is a color photograph, when you see the wood color, it's always like the kitchen or whatever that doesn't show the bedrooms that have these purples and the greens, and it's like, well, this is super random. You know, like it's a lie. We've been sold a lie.
And I think that's also the danger with architectural education, in that within the studio building, within the lecture theatre, the way in which architecture is taught and conveyed isn't what the architecture is about in reality. And students learn what is being conveyed rather than understanding it's about all these other things, all these other experiences, and how these experiences come together. And that's what makes good architecture. So my kind of critique of contemporary architectural practice and contemporary places that are made, they all seem to be veneer thin in terms of presence. Like any mall you go to, any lack
corporate building,
any corporate building. It's all about.
It's also good formulaic, right? It's like, okay, glass facade, cool. Some bit of curves, cool. It's got those LED strip lights, cool. It's got some weird patterning happening with the facade in some way. It's like raised off the ground, parking's underneath. It's got all it's got the planted walls and planted floors and planted roofs, and it's all like green, and they use high performance glass, and it's all very much like a frontage to you. You can't look into it. It's very like distance from you. I'm kind of referring everything that's happening in Sandton basically, but that's what it is, right?
But so like all of those spaces, when you go to them, you know, they they tick a whole bunch of boxes and they look in a very particular way as a style.
Yeah.
But as a place that has presence and has atmosphere, they mute and they, in a way, dead. They lack any kind of magic. And like exceptional buildings you go to, the first thing you go is, it's not like, this thing's beautiful. It's, this thing has some kind of magic that's indescribable, and it exists, and it's very difficult to pinpoint where it is, but it's there. And I think, really good architects like Peter Zumthor.
Dude, I was just going to talk about his building now. Can I just get into the... So the first time I visited one of his buildings, it was a building, it's in Cologne, Cologne, and it's a museum. And I think it was I don't know, like a ruin that was like bombed in the war. And then he built this parasitic architecture over whatever this ruin was. And the thing that blew my brain on, like, it was just ridiculous, is there was a handle for a door. And it was essentially, I don't know if this is true, but this is what I remember. Like it was essentially a hewn stone door, so solid stone, pivot door, and the handle was almost like it had been carved out with water. It was this immaculately curved, beautiful handle that was carved out of the wall, out of the door, and I saw this thing. I had to go feel it immediately. I had to embrace and touch and put my hand on this. Like, how does this? And it was this, there's this building in I don't want to go too critical of people's buildings, but in Rosebank, wherever it is, essentially there's a straight line and then there's a curve, and they kind of blend into each other. But that curve is not tangential to the line. So what happens is the curve hits and it creates a corner where these two are like now joining. It is so jarring to see that. And this door that was made out of stone that had, I don't know how, I mean, they must have used water carving, or I don't know how they did that, but it is so beautifully curved, and everything is just exactly as it should be. And like I said, and it fits your hand like a glove. It is just like, oh man, that feels good. And exactly, put it some sort of, like, you can look at his buildings and they kind of look okay. They don't, like for example, his bathhouse, like, yeah, it's nice to look at and whatever. But I bet as an experience, you just like goosebumps over and over again, just all the time. Have you been to one of his buildings?
No, I haven't.
We're gonna have to make a mission, Dirk. Because fuck, man, I'd love to get, as part of your atmospheres. Like, he is the atmosphere king.
Yeah. But so for me, what's interesting with Peter Zumthor is that he studied to be a carpenter first.
I was about to say he's a carpenter, yeah.
So, and that's the link that I had with kind of making stuff at university, is that you then, when making things, you then begin to intimately understand that these things have presences. Like in teaching, the thing that I always struggle with students is wood is a category, and all wood is exactly the same.
Oh, yeah.
And when you're making something like Oregon pine is radically different in material, in aura, in presence, in the way it works, in the way it communicates, just from standard construction pine. And oak is different to beech, and all of these things are a language. All of these have characteristics, personalities. They, if you imagine different genres of music, the one's classical, the other one's heavy metal, the other one's, pop music, and they have these different qualities.
Would you say they're as distinct as that? Because because my mind automatically goes, maybe Dirk means that all of them are heavy metal and they're just different bands within that category. But if you, in your mind, it's like, no, this is classical. That's fucking heavy metal. That's a bit of death metal. That's some EDM. That's
exactly. They're radically different personalities, and I think the beautiful thing about making is I built a kind of I bought a flat in town and kind of built most of the furniture in there. and a lot of the stuff was some of the stuff's made out of concrete. And the thing, it was the first time I had ever cast like complex concretes, and this thing had a long span.
Was this a table? What is this?
So it was a step that became a counter that became an entrance canopy that then becomes part of a set of cupboards.
And did you cast that as one?
It's one piece that kind of it folds and wraps and
mad.
And
so just to kind of explain, so you basically you had to build a mold.
So made the formwork.
I'm going to use simple terms. You used the mold.
Yeah.
And then you had to put cake mix into this mold.
So it had to put in the structural reinforcing that the kind
which is steel basically that's bent into the different places so that it's structural.
And then put in the
cake
concrete,
mix.
the cake mix.
Yes.
Okay. And
that's insane.
So supporting all of that in the casting process
while it's curing, while the cake is busy baking.
While the cake is baking. And therefore, like, this table's got this gap over here, and then in making it, there all these supports, and then taking this thing that's wet and runny and is, in a way, kind of an unruly child that always wants to seep out the edges, and you've got to.
Were you doing that while it was casting? It was like pushing out.
At some of the places that broken the shutter work, so like while you. And because it's a process, it has to be cast in one go. I couldn't stop the casting process. So it's while fixing this error in the formwork, people are bringing concrete and pouring concrete so that we could do this all in one go.
I was about to say, luckily you had help doing the concrete.
Yeah. Okay. So, and then this thing sits and cures, and then you take out all the formwork, and all of a sudden this thing can span. And do these things that are magical. Like you go like, wow, like it was this wet. And so like I was part of the whole process of, we'd get in the cement, we'd get in the aggregates and then carry it up all the floor. So I knew all the components and I saw the components as part of the mixing process, part of the pouring process, part of the making of the formwork process. And in that process, you are embodied, and you especially with concrete, you see the wetness. So like you in the wetness, and you
like you floating it and vibrating it.
Vibrating it, you're getting into the mess of it, and then you strip it all out, and all of a sudden it's this thing that there's now an outside, but it's inside. You intimately know what this thing is like on its inside. And that understanding of materials inner being, for me, was fascinating. And it's the same when working wood. When you run a plane across one wood and you run it across another wood, you actively feel the difference in its grain and its texture. It makes a very particular sound that's different from different grains of material. And you, in a way, you in that material according to its qualities and characteristics. So these things, it's not this material wood is not the same. They're not all the same thing. They have these different qualities that differentiate them as personalities that are quite radically different.
And it's almost like if you kind of imagine the mass manufacturing of things we've lost that quality. So for example, a machine doesn't know that. We don't know, but let's just assume now that the machine doesn't know the difference between pine versus Oregon versus beech, birch, all of these different things. But it's when you're using the tool, when you're using the table saw, the bandsaw, you feel the resistance, the kind of the hardness of that wood, the density of that wood. Mm-hmm. Also, when you're picking it up and you kind of like, oh, this thing is a bit like, it's a bit unruly, like it's fighting me. With other materials, you kind of just like butter can slice through it. So you're kind of getting, this is what you like. It's like there's like these qualities that are personalities of this type of wood.
Yeah.
And it's probably, and this is obviously just, within each plank, it'll be different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, and that's what my mind was going to, is that like, each plank, although all this wood is heavy metal, this is one band, this is another band, so there's because they're not all the same tree.
Yeah, and then there are nuances in those
In that as well.
in those personalities as well, and that's also what Peter Zumthor talks about. Like when putting a building together, it's bringing all of these personalities together, and like I was talking about making an artwork, bringing all these things together. At what point do they come together in a way that it
Light. When is it a
lights
light?
up, it ignites, and that's what I argue is in kind of commercial architecture, because it's all this architecture done at a distance. So, and what I mean that through the digital interface, through not the materials themselves, but through drawing, plan sections, elevations.
Not by hand as well. It's not drawing. It's drawing.
Yeah, clicking. Okay.
Clicking.
That distance that's happened means that the spaces that are made, they all have this kind of voidness, this kind of alienatory quality, this kind of this empty glass facade.
I mean, I completely agree. I think because also the thing is, what's happening is, and it's not to say that. Okay, I also want to clarify that we're not critiquing the architects.
Yeah,
it's a system that is the critique.
It's a critique of the industry,
Yes.
and I think it's a critique of the way architects are taught.
Yeah.
Because the way they're taught is to feed that industry. And that industry is the core of that industry is to make money. Because in order to run a practice, you need to be profitable so that you can continue. But the set of skills that I argue that are missing is what Peter Zumthor talks about, like how do you bring these things together? And then what Peter Zumthor's got that innate knowledge because he studied to be a carpenter. But what happens to students or someone who's never made anything in their life, has never understood what this material's like, its inner life of that material. So you in a way, you illiterate. As an illiterate, you're writing novels. You haven't learned the nuances of words, but you're putting together.
And not only that, you're not even writing novels. You're writing textbooks, and you're not even writing. You're actually writing almost like Bibles that people, or kind of a very like established book, dictionaries or textbooks, or that people now have to read and live with.
Mm-hmm. And that also then becomes spaces where life happens.
Yeah, they're canvases.
All those subtle nuances of that theatre backdrop have been pulled out. So when you look at a lot of indigenous cultures and the way in which they describe the places in which they live and their connection to that place, often it's mythologized or it's spoken about in terms of energies or spirits, but that subtle nuance of I'm deeply connected to the place because of the way in which this color of soil is. Or if you look at kind of a walkabout of Australian Aborigines, of singing the land, of making that connection between this landscape and the verbalization as a means to kind of navigate that landscape, but also a means to kind of connect you deeply to that particular place.
I mean, just to talk to me about this, I don't know about this at all. So when you say a walkabout, are they using their vocal languages, all the kind of, and obviously we have to acknowledge that we don't necessarily know this. Yeah. So we have read people writing about this.
Exactly.
So it's, again, this is not an embodied experience.
Yes.
So we're doing the exact thing that we just say we don't want people to do.
Yeah. But at
the same time, I want to hear what you want to say.
So in Australian Aboriginal culture, they have what's called as song lines, and each clan has a particular song lines. And
what is that word? Song
lines.
Line
is a
line.
Yeah.
Okay. There's line.
There's a book by Bruce Chapman called Song Lines that kind of talks about this, and each clan has got a certain song line. And these are, in a way, maps of territories. So by singing the song lines, you can navigate a particular landscape. And if you go into another clan's landscape and you have access to that song line, you can navigate that landscape. And apparently these song lines connect as a tapestry of ways of navigating the.
So they've used essentially song to map territories.
Yes, and but that mapping, that landscape is not a objective landscape as in a Western.
Oh, like a boundary. This is South Africa. This is Botswana. There's the line.
And also, it's not the landscape is not a mute thing. That landscape is embodied with mythology, with beings, with presences, with energies, with this rock and has a whole narration to it, and it embodies various ancestral spirits, landscape spirits, animal spirits. So moving through the landscape, they sing these lines as a means to navigate the landscape, but also to reactivate,
reawaken these
and animate that within one's own being and consciousness as a means to connect one both to the landscape, to connect to one's culture, to one's spiritual and history. And you can see how in that scenario, that landscape isn't, and things aren't mute, things aren't inanimate. All of these things are alive, they have presences, they have energies, they communicate, they work with you, they work against you, they and I would argue it's no different in making something, in creating something, in creating a space. How does this space connect me to the landscape? How does it connect me to my history, to my culture? And that in a way is, I would argue, what architecture does. It takes all of those things and it holds it in time and space.
So I'm going to ground this a little bit because I think we kind of, and it's great that we went in that place. But for example, this house, right? This is one of my childhood homes.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I have memories of me having lands with my friends in this space.
Having
lands. Oh,
I don't know.
Okay. Everyone brings their computer and we set up our computers and we can play computer games.
Okay.
So like Warcraft 2 or 3, and Dota and all these games we played here. Like I have a memory of sitting, for example, right there, facing this way, one of my best friends sitting there, James sitting there, and we're all kind of playing this game against each other and other, friends sitting in different places. So this space is embodied, and there's many other memories. I have a memory of my sister and I fighting about who gets to use the computer, as an example, or and having battles around that, over there. So there's a lot of memory and meaning that is in the space, and that's just through me that has been in the space. And obviously, my sisters and them also have these kinds of memories. So imagine, like, if you extrapolate that over, I don't know how long those cultures were there for.
Yeah.
But the myths making and the meaning of that rock, and this is where the great whoever did this, and or the healer did that, and or whatever it may be, the novice or the painter or the artist or the whatever kind of archetype you want to attach to it did in a certain location, and by singing these things they're able to like vocalize and memorialize and remember these kinds of moments and things that happen. Like if I, for example, walked into this space and said all these things that happen, this space would start becoming embedded and infused with my kind of presence that comes into it. Mm-hmm. And the tragedy also is that when this house gets sold and when it gets, when it moves on to the next owner after 25 years of ownership, and that's just slate is wiped clean. It's gone.
Yeah.
It's just, I had this weird memory of going to my childhood home. So this was before my parents got divorced, we lived in a house in Parkview, and in many ways it was like a sanctuary for me. It was it had an amazing garden, amazing trees. I loved climbing trees as a kid. I loved climbing on the roof. Apparently that's an autistic thing, but that's interesting. I like kind of would like try and survive on the roof, like in the midday sun, which is absolutely insane. I take my little sister's umbrella, some water, and like see how mthe minutes can I survive up there. But anyway, so this childhood home had all these incredible memories, and I remember I used to make a fire in the cellar underneath the floorboards that my sister, kind of would her bedroom. And because I loved fire so much, as mentioned earlier, and I loved making fires. And my dad, would catch me and then he would, berate me and hit me and whatever. And eventually he told me this really intense story about me. He kind of described a narrative, like a scenario where effectively I created a fire, my sister was playing upstairs, and then this fire started getting out of control. And then eventually, the floorboards were lit, and then my sister was caught in this room, and then she would burn to death. So extremely traumatizing, horrible story. I never made fire there ever again. That's how effective. So anyway, this house was filled with this stuff, tons of these kinds of memories. And my dad sold it when we were, I don't know, what's like 11 or 12, somewhere there. And then years later, it came onto the market. We went and visited it maybe like 10, 15 years later. And the gap is me being preschool or being pre-high school, and then me being at varsity. So it was a big gap. And the people who had then bought the place, or the people after them, had renovated this house. And they'd moved things around like crazy. Like the main bedroom had moved, and the lounge had moved, everything had changed. And we arrived at the space, the entrance had changed. There used to be quite a lot of thresholds that you'd go through to get to the house. That had all been eradicated. It just was like a plain, straight, actual entrance straight into the house. You walk in, it used to have this vestibule that you'd come into, and a place to put all your stuff down, a place to take off your jacket. Literally that whole space, demolished, gone. Now you just walked straight in from the entrance, you walked straight into the house. There used to be a little canopy that you'd go underneath before you went to the front door. That was removed. And so now you get into the space, and first it was that little anteroom, you get into the anteroom, and then you get into the lounge, and then there was this insanely beautiful fireplace, which we never used, but it was there, and there was this big fireplace, and all of those little walls and little spaces were all eradicated. It was just one big, massive, undefined, horrible, useless. Like when I say useless, I mean there was no magic. There was no exploration. It was just like one space. You could see the kitchen. They made this thing open plan. And the worst thing was, because it was a heritage house, it was built in the 30s, the fireplace, which is something that is so strange about like the way heritage councils work in Johannesburg, and maybe there's something worth exploring, but the fireplaces are super special. We have to keep these fireplaces. Okay, fine, we keep the fireplace. What makes that fireplace amazing is that it has a wall next to it on either side that is staged correctly. And this like links back to the building and to the artwork. That fireplace has presence. So what do? No, we demolish the walls next to it, and you look straight past the fireplace and you look outside. And then this fireplace is basically meaningless. It has nothing. It has no soul. It has no character. It doesn't ground the space. It doesn't hold the space. It's not a focal point for the space. It is basically just a waste of time even being there. You might as well just get rid of it because there's no meaning to it anymore. And so this building, and it was crazy. All these memories were just like I was like being attacked by all these like crazy memories, and I was like, it was quite traumatizing actually, because there's just all this stuff that came up that was unbidden. It was like a door that had opened, like a torrent that had, like the dam walls had been flooded down, and all this water just came smashing me in the face of all these memories, and yet they were bastardized. It was perverted. It was twisted. It wasn't the memory of what it was. It was now, because I have a memory of having opened my first Lego set in front of that fireplace and building my first Lego set in front of that fireplace, and how powerful that was for me. And now I was like, yeah, but this doesn't mean anything. This is like fucking shit. And the crazy thing is that I went into that cellar where I had made that fire. And in the back was a bunch of parquet because I saw the main house, they turned one of the rooms into a bedroom. Because this is always the thing that happens, right? People kind of build and they just chuck it in the cellar. And I knew exactly where the cellar was. And I went to the cellar. It's the same door. And it is the same handle. And the weirdness of my hand being a boy's hand when I first used it, and now it being like an adult hand, like it was fucking weird. And then opening this thing and there's still some fucking ash from the fire that I had made there 15 years prior.
Wow.
Or 20 years, whatever it was. No, it was more than that. It was 20 years. And maybe not that much, and then looking at the back, and then I see the fucking parquet, and it's just so bizarre, like, especially that time difference and the kind of who you are, and the process of becoming a man and all that stuff that happens, or an adult rather. It was deeply, deeply disturbing.
But then if one looks at buildings that hold those histories, of culture, of people, of passage of times, of generations, patinas of hands moving across surfaces, and don't say like that needs to be eradicated. That is part of the, and that's why this interest with kind of Gothic cathedrals. Because a lot of it's gone through passage of time. The building that I'm looking at for the PhD, parts of the building have been eroded, parts of it have been fixed and renewed. There are things there, places where the floor has been eroded through movement, where the inscriptions are no longer visible. But you get a sense that all of these things that you're talking about haven't been thrown away, but they've been kept and they've been acknowledged, and that it's a public space, it's a communal space, and that this building is this, like in the landscape that we discussed earlier, is a thing that holds those memories, those presences, those energies. And for me, it's this the problem with contemporary work, especially in South Africa, is that it's about this time. It's about showing off, about being built in 2000, and that's it. Where these buildings are talking about these generations and these layers of history, one on top of the other, and all of those histories are different. They diverse, but the building holds those memories, that time. And when you go into that building, you're not on about this time, you're about this deeper stratum of time. And you feel the way that we talked about, you're feeling presences, auras, you feel that. And all of a sudden, rather than being this thin slither of existing in this moment in time, you feel like you have access to these deep layers of time.
But also, there's more here, because if you think about, never mind the building. Well, okay, once the building is complete, fine, absolutely what you're describing. But this building, because they're as big as they were, and there was, the labor was as slow as it was, and everything was carved to the nth degree, and because it wasn't about making money, it was about worshiping a higher power. There was no, there was limit of resources, but not really. So there was generations of stonemasons, father to son, and son to son, and son to son. They just kept going, so that there would be, I don't know how long these cathedrals took. But look at the Sagrada de Familia. That's been going since the 20s. It's not done yet, I don't think. I don't think it's and that's with modern techniques. They are using stonemasons, obviously, but they are also using modern techniques. There's a bit of reinforcing happening, steels happening, all of that. If you look back, 300 years ago, or whatever, even 1,000 years ago, more than that. Look at the Egyptians, how long they took to build these structures, and the meaning and the lives that went into that. And we can even look at that and go, fuck, that's all the lives that went into that. And the big thing is that because the person is literally using their body to make this thing, they're infusing that humanness, that quality of presence, of being into the thing that they're making. And then there's 100, 200, 400, whatever, 1,000 of us doing this, that is enforcing all this fucking personality and soul and stuff into this building, into the material that we're making it. And then it's also typically situated in a space that has something. There's a magical quality in the location that it's been built.
And I would say is part of your cultural identity and your cultural being.
Yeah.
So unlike in our culture, buildings are in a way largely commercialized and privatized in a way. So the collective toiling of a space, the collective making of a space, and the ability to access that collective space as a collective is less and less so. So like if you're looking at the Gothic cathedral, the people when it was built, small village, a homogeneous culture, identity predominantly, and then kind of investing energies into a building that then kind of articulates one particular culture's history and identity, and then living in and around that through a number of generations. And the way that kind of building then holds those things through time.
Yeah, it almost becomes like and never mind the fact that these buildings, these Gothic cathedrals, and obviously we don't want to just say this only applies to Gothic cathedrals.
No,
this is to all cultures.
Yeah.
This is a human story.
Yeah.
That there's an honoring and a celebrating of the dead, of your past generations, and these buildings have spaces for that. The graveyards, obviously, but they're not called graveyards, are they? In Gothic cathedrals, whatever.
I mean,
the cemeteries, whatever. But the point is that not only are these buildings representative of people because of the pews being worn with patinas and the kind of stone you can feel, you can look at. There's a chisel. I mean, I remember seeing this random clip of someone had taken a photo of a character that had been carved, and it was again in some church, and it was basically this character with this enormous penis. So, and that was done like 400 years ago. So this guy was like, hey, fuck this. No one is going to see this. I'm going to carve this. So there's not even that. There's also personality that's coming into these buildings. On top of the fact that it's right next to literally your graveyard where all your dead are being buried. So it's becoming this repository of just insane humanity that is just being fed into this kind of self-circulating, the self-fulfilling, what is it? Whatever that is. Compare that to exactly what you're saying. Compare that to what we're building now. Like,
and how we build.
Yeah.
Like the thought, okay, we'll build a building with understanding it will be up for 20, 30 years, and we'll knock it down and build the next thing. And how can we do this that it's quick and cheap and easy? The kind of care, craft, presence, energies aren't the things. I would argue that the things that give value to life. So when you feel those things, you feel like I'm rooted in time, I'm rooted in culture, I'm rooted in being. My life has been enriched by these set of experiences, and these are the places in which we live. These are the places in which we inhabit, and we've stripped all of those things out to in contemporary terms, to be a style. So it's like, I've always griped about clients. Like, I want my house to be in this particular style.
Yeah.
And you realize the only thing that's of concern about this place where we inhabit, that has all these beautiful stories, all these beautiful memories, is just about what it looks like on a magazine cover. It's just about that surface presentation rather than that complex, layered, often ineffable set of experiences that give gravitas, meaning, value, and enrich the lived experience.
Dirk, you're describing something here that just kind of, you're triggering a couple of thoughts here. So the first one is that, so we've been working a lot of spas of late. So we started designing a bunch of lodges, well, not, kind of working on lodges and then working into spas. And the thing that is fascinating about these spa designs, spa buildings, is that we finish them and we're like, cool, we now want to take some photographs. You can't take good photographs of them. It doesn't work. Like, you take the photograph, you're like, okay, this is the building. But it is effectively meaningless, because when we design these buildings, when we kind of go through the process of design, for example, there's this one project in Rwanda, and the kind of conversation was around the external facade. Like we were discussing like the importance of the elevational drawings for this building. And Prina like going, they're not that important actually. Because the thing that's driving this design has absolutely nothing to do with what it looks like. It's the experiences that we're trying to create through this process of this building, that the journey that you're feeding through from arrival going into like a kind of reception holding space that then takes you to a central space that opens up but is less open, and then eventually through many kind of thresholds and different experiences end up in a treatment room where you get your massage, where it's dark and it's moody and you can't see shit, and it's just, a very visceral sensory kind of experience. And then the process of coming back out of that into a kind of a holding space that then takes you through that whole process back out into a open space that's still held, and then eventually back into reception, and then you leave. And so this building is not going to photograph well. I mean, it looks okay. It looks cool, like from the top, like, ooh, the plan is interesting, whatever. But it's not, unless you go to this building, you're not going to think it's special. And the irony is that it's fine. But the problem is, because we have all these competitions and things, and no one goes to the, I had someone told me about a building that Peter Rich did. He did Mapungubwe, the one that won the awards. And he went there. He did a post about it and kind of said it was a weird experience, like going to this building. And it kind of felt really jarring. Like, how could this win World Building of the Year? And it just feels weird. I suspect also that it had been retrofitted with things that because this is also the thing, you design a building and you have this intention, but then we don't make the building, someone else makes the building, and there's a contractor and there's budget and there's a client that needs certain things. And
there's politics.
And there's politics and there's all kinds of things. The fact that we even get a building in the end is a miracle, that works. Let's just say if it works and the plumbing works and the roof doesn't leak and it does all the things, in fact, we've won. But actually, it's a bit of a tragedy, because it's such an opportunity to do something, really kind of meaningful. Heather Wicks talks about Heather Wicks Studios. He wrote a book called Humanize, and he talks about designing buildings for 1,000 years. Like, we don't do that anymore. We design 30-year buildings. Like, I think Joburg apparently has gone through 5 or 6 complete rebuilds.
And that I would argue is the problem of Johannesburg. It makes you placeless. It makes you timeless. Timeless in the sense that you without time. Whereas in other cities or cultures where they've honored and recognized the meaning of those things, you sense the presence of time, as in time has duration, and that you as an individual with a limited time frame are part of a larger continuum. Whereas in Johannesburg, it's me, because I can't sense these other histories, these longer histories. And these histories in Johannesburg are fairly short, but they're even shorter because we've demolished all of these other things before.
I mean, what's crazy, so like the areas that I kind of grew up when I was a kid were these really old, I say old, they're not old. I mean, Parkview Golf Course has under their banner, I think it's 1913. Congratulations, you've made it over 100 years. What the fuck is that? Like, it's not even a thing yet, If you're talking about Patna, it's 2 lifetimes actually, or 1 lifetime actually. 2
generations.
I mean, they consider generation 25 years, which makes no sense to me.
Lifespans.
Lifespans, I'm saying it's lifespans. If you look at the average age now, it's 1 life, 1 and a bit. You said something that was really interesting to me. You said, this makes a good architect.
I would argue.
What is that in your mind? What makes a good architect?
Someone who, like, when you walk into a place, like it's not about style or aesthetics. It's something that hits you immediately, and it's that sense of presence. This place has a sense of presence. It has an energy. It has a liveliness. It changes the way I see the world through the way the architecture is articulated. That for me is an architecture that's good. An architecture that has atmosphere. It isn't mute in its expression.
If you describe a building like that, I mean, first I just want to say I love what you said, because to me, we're so focused on, does it respond to a brief, or does it respond to the ecological environment? Does it, but this is like, no, does it bring meaning?
Yeah.
What if you were to imagine a building that does that for you? So you mentioned Peter Zumthor, and I'm imagining he would do that. Corbusier's, you mentioned some Gothic cathedrals that have that in presence. What kind of 2-3 buildings do you say, or do you feel has that, or have had that? Maybe they don't have it anymore, but they had it at one point when you visited them.
So, if we're looking at kind of local architects, I'd say local architects to do that well is Sylvia Reck.
Sorry, I'm not talking about the architects. I don't care about the architects.
Okay.
I want to know about the buildings.
So, in terms of Sylvia Reck, I think a lot of these buildings do exactly that. They might have dated, they might have aged, but there's a very particular presence that the spaces inhabit. And he's gone through a number of styles, if you like, but even within those styles or ways of making architecture, there's a particular presence. And I think that makes him a good architect that stands out from other people, in that he's got ability to make spaces that have got gravitas.
What do you think is the ability? Why do you think he has that?
I think because, again, it comes through generations of craftsmen.
Okay. His father or him?
His father was a carpenter, or I don't know, I assume was a carpenter. His cousin's a carpenter. His wife's father, when I was there, was making furniture, physically making. It was quite complex furniture. He lived on site and made buildings on site together with craftsmen. So, and built those kind of relationships between different craftsmen. Local craftsmen would use local materials that came from the site and figure out how to build with that. And I think it's those kind of relationships, even though he was someone, like, if you put a tool in his hand, you'd be at a loss of what to do with it. He had an innate sensibility of how these things came together. And like when you go into the spaces, they hold that in some kind of way.
The thing that's interesting about him now is that he's become famous because of the Iron Man house that he designed in Cape Town.
Okay, so I don't even know that building.
And this is the reason they call it the Iron Man house is because it is similar to the house that is featured in the Marvel movie of Iron Man. Like it has, it's got these like angled glazed panels. It's a bit like a Lautner kind of vibe from LA. The irony though is that this is what he's famous for, but his other stuff, his kind of lodges that he's done there's exactly what you're saying, like there's a flavor there. There's a grit almost that it's so embedded in that context that it cannot be moved. It only exists in that space. It can only exist in that space. It'd be fascinating to know how he even ran a studio from, how did he do that? Like he was living on site. My mind boggles at that. Like I don't know. I don't know how he could do that. Yeah.
And then I think a laterite for me, in that I knew the building.
Laterite is designed by
Le Corbusier, and I think it's a Cistercian was a Cistercian monastery. I think it's still partially acts like that, but it's predominantly a tourist site. And I knew the building from studying drawings, studying photographs. I thought I knew what it was like, and went into the chapel. So there's a whole priming that happens in going to the chapel, on walking around the ambulatory, and then sliding down in this long ramp that moves down into the chapel, and all of that's brightly lit from glazing on both sides, and the glazing sets up these kind of rhythms, and so as you walking down the buildings, kind of providing the music or the rhythms as you enter into the space. So there's kind of noise and procession as you come into the chapel. And then you come into the chapel, and the first thing that you notice is actually how dark it is, that you don't see in the photographs. So, in the photographs, you see it always kind of, lots of, primary colors and quite brightly lit. But it's a dark, immense volume. And then the acoustics of the space is of such a nature that the sound always bounces back to you. So when I was there, I was the only person in this space. And then so every step you take, you hear your step. And then all of a sudden you become highly self-conscious because you can hear yourself move. Your rustling of your clothing is making a noise. And then you sit down and you can hear your breathing in the space. And all of a sudden your awareness has been radically altered. And it all does it naturally through the acoustics of the space because the lighting has been lowered. And now all of a sudden you can't see the outside world. You're in this highly dark space with these gentle colors of light kind of being washed over with light. There's just the sense of kind of peace, but this hyper awareness of yourself within the space because the space is always reflecting you back to you.
Yeah, which is also this interesting thing because it kind of, if you imagine being watched, right? It's you be very aware of where you are in the space and that you're being watched. You're being watched by the building.
Yeah.
But the building is obviously a representation of God in a way, right?
Well,
or maybe not.
So I mean, it's not like for me, like as being an atheist, like I didn't see any religiosity in that space, but the ability of that space as a religious space, to bring you back into
the present,
to take you out of the endless chatter of your mind, the he said, she said, blah, 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 life, to take you back into this moment, to take you back into this kind of empty space of being in this particular moment in space. And architecture is a tool to do that without kind of a set of instructions. For me as an architect and an architect of presence, of understanding being human, to curate that set of experiences in such a way to have that effect. And again, not in a, you now have to believe in these set of rules, you have to do this for these things to happen naturally, in experiencing architecture in the way that architecture unfolds, for me is deeply profound. And for me then makes like an architecture who understands these things rather than someone who's interested in, just getting onto the next magazine cover.
Ticking a box. I mean, the thing that as you're describing that, I was just thinking, like, imagine a world where the main metric of your prestige or your kind of success was on the level of building that was completed. Not, and when I say that, I mean, like, for example, Priyan told me about this, but I don't know about this, but you mentioned that, like, Peter Zumthor talks about he takes a commission, takes a project on, and he says the building will be done when it's done. You go and get to tell him it's going to take you 5 years. You have to get this done in a year. Sorry, I don't work like that because I don't do good buildings like that. I need time to fully embody and embrace this thing of this building. I had an experience going to a site after having gone through the whole design process because of the way that we had a lot of these projects, these kind of like remote location lodge projects that we work on, they go through a design phase prior to actually commissioning the project. So they want to know, if we were to do this project, would it make us money? So they want to have like a basic concept design, they want to have an understanding of what, they need a kind of a preliminary type of costing. have a look at what the design actually looks like, look and feel, mood boards, all that kind of stuff is now conceptualized. So and the thing is that typically they want to do it quickly and they want to do it with minimal resources being input. So they're not going to send the architect to go to site, to explore the site, to feel the site, to make a decision based on site. No, you get Google Earth. You design with Google Earth.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to give you time. Typically how these things happen is like, you don't give you time to go through this very iterative process to find the right kind of option, or not the right, but the best solution at that time. It's a very quick, I got like 3 weeks, I got a month, that's kind of what we have. We have to get this thing done. A meeting, the meeting has invariably been set up before they approach, this has been my experience in the past, and it's not to critique it, it's just to explain the context within which these things happen. And so what happens then is that the sites and the meaning and the inspiration, or the kind of contextual influence that the site could have on the project is diminished. And invariably what will happen is you'll finish this design, you'll get accosted, cool, and they're like, okay, no, we're going to go to site now. So now your project gets green light. We're going to go. So you go to site. Do you think that you can redesign and start again? Mm-hmm. No. This train has started. We have started the engine. We are now going to build this thing that you've designed because we've got approval for it. Mm-hmm. We've got costing for it. You've spent time on it. We've invested. It's a sunk loss bias. We don't want to invest and change now, even though initially they're like, we're going to change it. Mm-hmm. In my experience, that's not really, you have some wiggle room.
Yeah.
And the problem is that then you come to site 6 months, once the thing starts being built, and you're starting to see the devastation that you've created because you haven't designed it in context. You designed it outside of context, and now you're trying to impose your vision onto the site, onto the environment, onto this cultural experience, everything. It's just, it's a fuck up. Mm-hmm. It is a disaster. Mm-hmm. And I go, I'm sensitive to these things. I'm aware of these things, and I'm like, I've had now, 1 or 2 where this has happened, and I'm like, this is not the way I want to work. Mm-hmm. And so now there's like a process of pushback that has to occur, but it's difficult. Now I've got new projects come in, like, okay, we need this process done. I'm like, yeah, okay, sure. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly the opposite of what Peter Zumthor does. Yeah. It's a mess. Mm.
But I think also, I think what was beautiful about what you're saying is how we live in particular systems and we live in particular values.
Yeah.
And what those values have an impact on the way in which we are in the world and how we perform in the world.
Yeah.
And when one has these other ideas, how difficult it is in order to implement them, because you're operating within these other values and these other systems. Because you're saying, oh, no, hang on, we need to relook at the site. Your client's going to go, well, there's money attached to that. Or if you're saying, okay, we'll do it out of the practice, your practice has to survive and, have a number of kind of incomes at certain time periods in order to kind of move on. And if you say like, we'll dispense with income 3 and 4, it might mean that's the end of the practice.
Exactly.
So
it's a very complicated balancing act, and there's a wonderful tension here, because one of the things here is like, why do you have a podcast? Why start a podcast? The reason for this is so that the buildings don't. I mean, I say reason. I hope that this can become more. Can develop more and create cash flows. We can think about that. And then what can happen is that then I can start designing buildings that way. Mm-hmm. So that we can start creating buildings the way we should be creating buildings.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not be dictated to, but I'm not saying become a dictator, but kind of just say like, in order for us to do the best building that we possibly can, this is the process we need to follow. And we're not being unreasonable going, we needed 10 years to design this building. No. We just give us double the time, and work with the client that can agree with that and work with that. Not to say that the clients are not doing that. It's just, there's a tension there because they're, like you said, they're in a system.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can't just rail against that system because then you're going to close. Yeah. You're not going to exist.
Yeah.
So it's to kind of be doing both. Okay.
So I think, so maybe as the kind of concluding and thing that ties it all together is, my experience of making and my experience of making artwork.
Yeah.
Because I think art, you're talking about kind of how things hold their presences through time. Art and art making is essentially about those ephemeral, ineffable qualities and trying to kind of bring them out. And good work does exactly that. And understanding that these are particular qualities, and that architecture is no different to an artwork. It's just it has a spatial dimension. And the thing about architecture is it has an ability to hold atmosphere, and to, like, if you're outside, like some days it's sunny, some days it's brooding, and feels heavy. So all of atmosphere on the exterior is temporal, but an atmosphere inside a building is held. There's some variations, but
That's nice.
there's something that's fairly stable within architecture. And it's to understand those kind of atmospheres, those presences as a designer, that you then make those presences, one, that they life enhancing, and that they're appropriate for the things that happen in those spaces.
I got one more question here for you. This is something that, okay, so it's grounded in this idea that the state that the architect is in, the designer is in, when they are designing, affects the thing they are designing.
Yes, but also their understandings of what it is that they want to achieve.
Okay, sure. But let's park that part of the conversation. So just to kind of ground this in terms of like a food again. So let's imagine you come home and you have a partner, and that partner, you had a really stressful day, and a lot of things went wrong. You lost a big project. This thing that you've been looking forward to is gone. And it's your turn to make dinner. So you're going to make dinner. You're going to get out the onion, you're going to chop it up, whatever. You're going to do the tomatoes, you're making a soup. But you're really not feeling the soup. You're fucking angry. So you fucking cutting this, whatever. Maybe you cut your finger, a bit of blood goes into the food, whatever. You make this meal and you serve it to this person. Okay. Now counter to that. You have an amazing day. Okay. Everything has gone right. You feel fantastic. You just got this big promotion, as an example. You've realized something about yourself that's been bugging you for years. You've unlocked a childhood trauma that you've been stuck with. You're like, why am I so weird in this weird context? Whatever it is, you come home. Like, you go get the cookbook, you find an amazing recipe, you have all the ingredients, you start putting some music, you chopping it up, you're cutting, you're whatever, doing all the prep work, and you drink a glass of wine and you're having a good conversation. There's this whole thing that's occurring, and now you make this meal, it's a soup, and you serve it to your partner. All things being equal, out of those two, when I say all things being equal, I mean, they say the recipe is the same, the food is the same, the ingredients are all the same standard. Which of those two is going to be better? And we can all categorically say it's going to be the second one, because there's an infusion that's occurred, that your state of being goes into the thing that you make. My mom made this one recipe once, and it was the most insanely good curry. She's doesn't cook curry, but she cooked this one curry out of this world. We licked the bowl clean. It was so good. And we're like, what did you do? What was so amazing? It's like, I just used some curry powder. I just chucked it with some chicken, and there it is, And yet there was something that happened in that meal that was just so freaking insane. And so my question to you is, do you think, does this what I've just described, if you're making an artwork, a drawing, a painting, a sculpture, or whatever, you spoke about mark making earlier, about it being like, oh, this anger is coming into it. It's in the work. It's embodied in the work. I can see the work. I can see the anger that you're feeling, and I can feel it myself. It feeds the artwork is almost a. I'm not saying this always happens. If I'm open to it, I will feel your anger coming through the artwork. Right? And do you agree? That's
yeah. I agree.
Now the same is for a building.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember his name. Um, he was also an architect. He's got a philosophy. What's it called? Being without a head. I don't know if you.
That sounds amazing.
So he had a kind of mystical experience where, and it's quite it's kind of ties into a non-dualistic philosophies and spiritual practice. But essentially, he had an experience where he realized, like, he can see his body, but where he thinks his head is actually the world. So that everything that he experiences around him is where his head is. So that his consciousness is the world, and everything that's inside him is that experience, and he is that experience. So in Western culture, we always so orientated between objectivity and subjectivity, and and often don't acknowledge the immense realm of the inner being, but how that inner being is deeply entwined and interconnected and reflected in our external world. And so the collapse of the interior, of who we are, how we feel, and how that reflects in the external world as a design practice, as a way of making things with consciousness and care. I think is critically important, and I think it also ties back to all kind of notions of craft, craftsmanship, how you embody that moment in time with materials that then become something else, and how that material then holds that presence. As a practitioner, as an artist, I think is kind of critical. And then being able to gauge that as someone. So you're talking about food making. A book I recently read, Blink. They talk about thin slicing and how you can become an expert in these kind of ineffable qualities. So you talked about kind of food and the difficulty in describing food, but you get a kind of a food taster profession who've categorized all these subtle nuances of taste, and they can explain to each other, how a particular brand of chocolate tastes and what the key notes of that particular chocolate are, because they've developed this highly nuanced language that describes very specific qualities, and they have the embodied experience and understanding of what those various differences are.
So they've linked language to experience and experience to language.
Yeah.
They've created their own dictionary, basically.
Exactly.
But also, it's not just a verb. It's not just a thought word. So for example, if to kind of ground that a little bit, if I say to you, so I do rock climbing. If I say to you, oh, I've climbed a 20, or the top grade in the world is like a 38, these numbers mean absolutely nothing to you. But if I say to you, I've climbed a 20 or a 25, I know the amount of pain and suffering and frustration and difficulty and training and injuries that have come into that. So that word means something very specific to me. I know I can gauge it, I can rank it, I can do all these things.
Yeah.
And that's just because of the jargon that's been established and the culture that's been established around that word. It's the same with architecture. It's the same with all these things. So for example, I've designed an airport. Most people go like, oh, it's an airport. You're like, but fucking airport, holy shit. What the fuck is going on, or whatever it may be. So just grounding that. So carry on. Sorry, I just want
to... Yeah, so all I'm saying is that as architects, a lot of these things are ineffable and difficult to describe, but they're things that we can train ourselves in. They're things that we can experience, perceive, understand them in an embodied way, and then they become tools that we can use as a specialist member of society to recreate these things for other people. and that kind of understanding of one's inner being as part of that ingredient that goes in the mix, that is our interface with the world, that there is no difference between us, the world outside, us between the architecture.
So it's almost like saying that the deeper you go into yourself, the deeper you develop these awarenesses, these sensitivities of you as a person, the more language, dictionary skills you will have to create the atmospheres and the presences that we've spoken about.
So like we talked about La Tourette.
Yeah.
So Le Corbusier was an atheist. So how does someone who has no belief in a religious realm produce something that so fundamentally touches the human core? And I would argue is because he's got a deep awareness of what it is to be in the world, and then articulate spaces to be in the world. And then it doesn't matter if you're a Cistercian monk or a hardcore atheist, these things are going to affect you because they touch the core of being human.
I'm going to link this to what you spoke about styles earlier, and that's La Tourette and any other kind of cathedral or any kind of these buildings that have this infusion into them. They could look anyway, because it's not about the look.
Yeah,
it's about the layering and the kind of thought processes and the atmospheres that are being created.
Yeah.
And
although I would argue they also
add to it.
The way they look has a particular zeitgeist.
Yeah.
So they are talking to a particular set of generations and a particular mood in time. And I think that's another thing architects can do. But I agree with you. The way they look isn't at the heart of the thing. They're more complex. So like if I was looking at a Gothic cathedral and the way I was taught about it in history, it's meaningless. It's a bunch of particular arches that look in a particular way. Whereas if I say it's about the atmospheric, the quality, the characteristics and qualities of a particular atmosphere, all of a sudden that has deep relevance and meaning to an atheist living in this time period, disconnected and disgusted by the systems and religious establishments that form these buildings, but I'm still deeply moved and make these places deeply meaningful to my experience of this thing we called life.
I think that's a great place to end it. Dirk, it is tradition on this podcast to say thank you with a sketchbook.
Oh, wow.
So this is your Draw Every Damn Day sketchbook.
Oh, man.
Also got Japanese binding, so
Oh, man.
no marks, so unfortunately no guides. And this is as a thank you present for coming to the podcast. So thank you very much. There will be only for Pete guests to come to this podcast. So
amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's really beautiful.
Yeah, it is. So just to kind of give context, so Dirk gave me this sketchbook for when I did some external examining at WITS as a very, very precious thank you. Also Japanese bound. So yeah, very cool.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Who makes your?
We use Right Gear to do this, actually.
Right
Gear. They're actually a stationery store based in Cape Town. But Priyan has some contacts there, so he kind of asked them if they can do sketchbooks, and they said they could. So
amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Fantastic. It's
thank you.
Very special.
And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to the Black Sable podcast, where we explore the hidden side of architecture. Everything we discussed in this episode will be available in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, follow, and subscribe. It makes a bigger difference than you know. If you'd like to follow us, you can follow us on Instagram and YouTube at BlackSableZA. This is Jacobus, your host for the Black Sable podcast. Thank you for tuning in.